Good afternoon, and welcome to this week's very special Humanities Forum. My name is Randy Payne, I'm the director of the Forum and a member of the philosophy department here at PC. The Forum exists to provide a regular space for the college community to come together in order to deepen our understanding and appreciation of humanities, and to encourage our communal intellectual life. As such, it provides a bridge between our core humanities curriculum, the development of Western civilization program, and the college as a whole. And today's event is particularly important for this mission of the Forum. I'd also like to express our gratitude in a special way to Prof. and the Office of Institutional Diversity, as well as to the Gladys Striegel Delmas Foundation for their substantial support of the Forum of today's event. Please join me now in welcoming to the podium Dr. Eric Bennett of the PC English Department, who will introduce today's distinguished guests.
Good afternoon. It is a convention of such introductions as this one that the introducer put the cart before the horse. The list of honors on such occasions provides an easy shorthand for the excellence of the speaker about to speak. In this case, Kwame Anthony Appiah pulls along behind him such a train of accolades that I could keep you here for some time making the cart go by. He received his education in philosophy at Cambridge University and has taught at Yale, Cornell, Duke, and Harvard. At Princeton, he became the Lawrence S. Rockefeller University Professor of Philosophy. Since then, he has moved to NYU. Professor Appiah has taught and lectured around the world and served as a trustee for Ofsi University in Ghana, where he spent his childhood in Ghana at the university, and where recently he has been invested with the chieftaincy of the Ashanti people. His list of publications begins in the mid-1980s with texts on probabilistic semantics and concludes, for now, this year, I think, with As If, Idealization and Ideals, a text which examines the informing role that abstractions play in science, ethics, and political philosophy. Of interest to us today, of course, is his important work on W.E.B. Du Bois. In between the start of his bibliography and its most recent editions lie dozens of books, book chapters, and articles on a wide range of topics whose dominant and unifying concerns are nevertheless clear. At last we get to the horse. At the heart of much of Professor Appiah's writing are questions easy to ask and difficult to answer. What constitutes an identity? How does belonging to a group enhance or diminish the autonomy of one's existence and the meaning of one's life? How exactly do my race, my ethnicity, my gender, my sexual preferences, and my religious beliefs determine who I am and what I'm entitled to and what I can and should expect from others? Also, must the things I cherish most deeply and believe most strongly have the same power over others as they do over me? If they do not, what keeps my values from washing out before my eyes? Can a world whose inhabitants are so culturally variegated and manifold partake of cultural universals? Should it even want to or try to? How do my ideals conduce to the good, and when should I modify them in light of the pressing contingencies of a life lived with other human beings? These are questions that all of us, if we take our education seriously and hold our principles dearly, should ask every time we look at the news or walk out the front door. Such questions involve multiple levels of awareness, historical, philosophical, but also experiential and quotidian. They belong to both the rigors of philosophic analysis and to the everyday usefulness of simple good advice. And among the greatest things to admire in Professor Appiah's writing is how deftly and with what truth it moves between these levels. The argumentative exhaustiveness of a high philosophical book such as The Ethics of Identity funnels elegantly into the colloquial lucidity of a general audience text like Cosmopolitanism, which runs again into even greater clarity and simplicity but no less profundity of the advice he offers readers of the New York Times Magazine in a column on ethics. Professor Appiah, in short, is a master of raising questions, and, though he might not like to hear me say so, a master of answering them. We are extremely lucky to have him speaking to us here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah to Providence College.
Thanks very much for that very generous introduction. I'm delighted to be with you here today. Dr. Bois spent a couple of years studying in Germany in the 1890s. And you could say that he fell in love with German culture, and you could say that he fell in love with German culture. And the source of his devotion was more than love for German music and art and poetry, because Germany, he said, was, quote, the land where I first met white folk who treated me as a human being. I met men and women as I'd never met them before. Slowly they became not white folks, but folks. I became more human. I ceased to hate or suspect people simply because they belonged to one race or color. In Berlin, what mattered more than his complexion was that he had acquired the silk tie and the gloves and the walking stick that marked him as a member of the Bildungsbürgertum, which is a splendid German word that means the educated middle classes. Bildungsbürgertum. To the typical Berliner, as the Bois understood, he was not a member of a subordinate American class. He was, however exotic his hue, just a man of a somewhat privileged student rank, with whom they were glad to meet and talk over the world. This experience shaped him profoundly. If you read Herder's 1781 book on the philosophy of the history of mankind, you'll recognize in it. You'll recognize in the Bois all the elements of the literary nationalism of the philosopher who was Wilhelm Traum. Herder thought that a folk, people, like an individual, should be true to itself, should be true to its own culture. And to put it another way, to speak in the language of Romanticism, being a German, or as the Bois would have argued and insisted, being an American or being a Negro, shapes the authentic self, whose expression is the project of a life. The Bois absorbed not just Herder's romantic conception of individuality, but also his picture of the spiritual life of nations. For Herder, every nation had a distinctive Volksgeist, a national soul, expressed throughout its social and cultural life. The nation's character can be found not only in the writings of its literary geniuses like Goethe, but also in folk songs and folk tales of ordinary people. Those of you who had the Grimm's fairy tales read to you as a children, those Grimm's fairy tales exist because the Brothers Grimm, inspired by Herder, went out to collect German folk tales as expressions of the German spirit. Later folklorists have discovered that some of them actually came from France. And others came from India. But the point is that they were collected as samples of German folklore. So the Bois's indication of this intellectual legacy is evident, I think, once you know something about the background. After all, his most famous book is called Souls of the Black Folk. Volksgeist seems to be hovering in there somewhere. So for Herder, each Volksgeist possesses something of distinctive value. He insists we recognize how different the spiritual lives of different peoples are. Nevertheless, as he says in the passage you can't see here, nevertheless holds that, as mentioned in Geschlechts and Ganzes, that's to say human beings are a whole, and as he goes on to say, we work and suffer, sow and reap for each other. Each folk needs to express its distinct character through its history, because it's only through each nation following its distinctive path that human history as a whole can achieve its meaning. Seeing the Negro as a folk among folks presupposes this implicitly global perspective of humankind. Black folks find their proper place among folks. White America, Du Bois, is also composed of folks too, of course, and because white Americans came, as Du Bois was very clear, from different European countries, they represented different national principles, so they weren't all one. So Du Bois, in referring to Du Bois's very preferences international in this way too, because he thinks of each group in the American congregation of nationalities as a local branch of a people whose character can be detected in its history elsewhere. Italian Americans are a branch of the Italian race whose history and culture can be seen in the history of Italy. So Du Bois's nationalism was cosmopolitan. Even when he's elaborating his deep faith in the Negro, he speaks not just of racial, but of human brotherhood. All races, including his own, are striving, he says, each in its own way, to develop a civilization, its particular message. Du Bois is cosmopolitan too in his openness to the achievements of other civilizations. His celebration of European, German culture, high and low, is always evident. In the souls of black folk, we can see this in the story of the essay called Becoming John, when the black John, the black character called John, is moved beyond measure by his first exposure to Wagner. And he says, he sat in dreamland and started when, after a break, rose high and clear the music of Lohengrin's swan. So, but Du Bois's cosmopolitanism wasn't just aesthetic. He accepted, too, a fundamental cosmopolitan moral idea, which was that he had obligations to those outside his racial horizon. He was also, as it happens, a methodological cosmopolitan, because he was always insisting on a globally comparative perspective, even when he was talking about the United States. The problem of Jim Crow, for example, is part of a global tragedy. Racism imposes Jim Crow in Georgia, but it also imposes a destructive colonialism in what he called, in one of his political formulations, Asia, Africa, and the islands of the sea. So he was an aesthetic cosmopolitan, a moral cosmopolitan, a logical cosmopolitan. How much more cosmopolitan could you be? How much more committed could you be to your sense of yourself as a citizen of the world, as well as a member of a national and a racial community? Bois was both a complete cosmopolitan and a complete nationalist. And it's hard for most contemporary readers not to think cosmopolitan nationalism is a contradiction in terms. Surely, cosmopolitanism, the idea that all human beings are in some sense fellow citizens of the world, is the very opposite of nationalism, the conviction that the boundaries of nationality should be the boundaries of citizenship. Well, elegant as this argument is, it's simply mistaken. But it's not mistaken in the way that someone with Bois's intellectual background, it's not a mistake he would make. Friedrich Heidegger, who was only a little older than Du Bois, and who, like him, had studied with the great German nationalist historian Transcript, wrote, just 5 years after the Source was published, cosmopolitanism and nationalism stood side by side in a close, living relationship for a long time. Which is why the book from which this passage comes is called Cosmopolitanism and the National State. 19th century European nationalism, in the elevated and philosophical versions that Du Bois knew, recognized that the demand for national rights only made sense as a moral demand if it was claimed equally for all nations. The structure of the argument is a form of argument we can't make familiar. my dignity cannot matter because it is mine, it has to matter because of its dignity. So too for nationality. My nation cannot matter because it's mine, it has to matter because it's a nation. Du Bois's defense of the Negro and of the legitimacy of Negroes like himself having a higher degree of concern for their own kind was always framed by the recognition both that Negroes had obligations to people of other races and that they could gain greatly from conversation across the races, from conversation outside their own group. His nationalism, his partiality for the Negro never descended into chauvinism. When he is critical of white people, it's almost always for their failure to recognize and implement the universality of the very values they claim as their own. Du Bois always recognized the risk that black folk, too, facing a world in which so many of the white people they met would disdain contact with them, would be forced into an uncosmopolitan withdrawal from the contact across nations and peoples, the contact that the cosmopolitan claims is vivifying and essential. He makes the point in one of his autobiographies, Das Dawn, he lived long enough to write a number of them, when he talks of the way American racism imprisons black people within the race. Quote, practically this group imprisonment within a group has various effects upon the prisoner. It becomes provincial. His attitude towards the environing race congeals into unreasoning resentment and hatred. This attitude adds to the difficulties of conversation, intercourse, understanding between groups. And in the same vein, in his essay, Assault of White Folk, Du Bois expressed pity for white Americans imprisoned and enthralled, hampered and made miserable by racism, in much the same terms. Too, were held away from the vivifying conversation with others that racism interrupts. Du Bois's German intellectual roots can be found in many of his positions. To understand his enthusiasm for liberal education, for example, which is the main topic today, it helps to bring another romantic term into view. It's a term that I already mentioned, namely Bildung. I use it in the context of talking about the Bildungswürde, the educated bourgeoisie, which John Stuart Mill shows, I think, wisely to translate as self-development or development, rather than just as education. For Herder and Husserl, Bildung proceeded along two dimensions: the development of cultures as pools and the development of individuals within those cultures, and both of these things matter. Wilhelm von Humboldt, sorry, that's the passage about how being trapped in the group. Wilhelm von Humboldt was in. Whose engagement with Bildung had a practical as well as a theoretical bent, because he was the Prussian Minister of Education. Wilhelm von Humboldt advanced a kindred argument in somewhat greater detail. Writing in the early 1790s, Humboldt addressed the question how individual and collective development was related. Relationships, he argued, make it possible for us to draw upon each other's cultural resources. But, he went on, the utility of such relationships for Bildung, the self-development, entirely depends on the extent to which the independence of those in the relationship is maintained at the same time as the intimacy of the relationships. So, I need to benefit the group, but also remain individual. So while he conceded that being German, or as the voice of a Negro, could shape the authentic self as expression of the project of your life, this was only consistent with self-development if you could at the same time maintain your independence and your individuality. So the educational implications were clear. The true end man, who about, was the highest and most harmonious development of his powers as a whole. A complete education, he wrote, as a single essential foundation, the mind of the lowliest day laborer must originally be attuned with the soul of the most finely educated person. If the former is not to fall below human dignity and become British, the latter is not to become sentimental, fantasy-driven, eccentric. Even having learned Greek might, in this matter, be something as far from futile for the carpenter as making tables for the scholar. Humboldt looked back, of course, to a long tradition. Cicero, nearly 2 millennia earlier, defended the poet Archias by defending the importance of humanistic learning. This is a Catholic school, so I'll put that in that. I'll now read in my English translation. For when Archias first left boyhood and turned from those huge arts by which young boys, this is a Ciceronian sentence that goes on for quite a long time. I read it in very amazing and double, but it's hard. For when Archias first left boyhood and turned from those arts by which young boys are gradually molded ad humanitatem, he devoted himself to the study of writing, first of all at Antioch, where he was born there in a noble place, which was formerly a famous and rich city, abundant in the most learned men and the most liberal studies, and there he succeeded speedily in showing himself superior to all in talent and in fame. Now it's true, I didn't translate that humanitas because I'm going to say something I think humanitas means here. It's true that humanitas, as the Latin dictionary said, it just means English human nature, humanity. But it's clear enough what Cicero has in mind here when he says that Archias was molded ad humanitatem. He's a second sense of the term, namely, and I'm now going to quote famous Latin dictionary, mental cultivation befitting a man, liberal education, good breeding, elegance of manners or language, refinement. And that's a very important sense of the word humanitas in Latin, and in many Latin dictionaries, when it gives you that sense, it says in parentheses, mostly in Cicero's. So Cicero is the person who invented this way of using the word humanitas. Picking up, however, on something in there, the mention of a liberal education, liberal studies, let's remember that Cicero says that Archias' native city was rich in the most liberal studies. Now, the studia liberalis were studies or enthusiasms or endeavors, as far as the dictionary again, befitting a free man. That's where the liberalis comes from. So when Cicero speaks of Archias' boyhood education as having molded him ad humanitatem, he must mean that he had provided him with an upbringing befitting a gentleman, a free man, as opposed to a servant or a slave. And he must have understood that such an education would produce a kind of cultivation and refinement that was eminently worth having. Because he's arguing with judges here about why they should admit Archias to Roman citizenship. So only if this thing is a very precious and valuable thing that the lawyer's argument makes much sense. Now, we are rightly suspicious these days of making distinctions like these because they refer religiously to the contrast between the free man and the slave, or the gentleman and the leather orders. And if, as Pierre Bourdieu once argued, the function of humane literary cultivation was just to mark us off from the uneducated, then the humanities conceived in this way would be simply undemocratic and at least wouldn't endorse it. But Bourdieu's thesis is not something I'm even slightly inclined to accept. That a humane education can permit you to show off, I don't want to deny. So can long practice in golf. But that's hardly the best argument against that tedious sport. The reason I have no difficulty in defending the idea of the humanities as an education for free men and women is that one of the great achievements of the modern world has been to establish a global consensus that we ought all to be free. Bois, who was an African American, could not have been more committed to the importance, or more aware of the importance of freedom, also saw this connection. In that sense, which might call the central dogma of liberalism, that individuals are all entitled to lives of their own, lives in which the vital shaping decisions are for them to take, lives whose decisions are not to be settled for them by a master, that idea is increasingly becoming the property of mankind and womankind. And if you are to discharge the terrific responsibility of making your own life, then surely you will help if you get. So why does an education in humanities and education in education provide some of the help you need? After all, you might think that what you actually need is to be found, say, in the sciences. Psychology can tell you what it takes for a normal person to achieve satisfaction. The social sciences help you think about what the effects of various public policies might be. In physics, chemistry, and biology tell us how the world works so that we can manage it. Now those things are all true, but how will you learn which satisfactions are really worth having? How will you learn which effects are worth aiming for? How will you learn what is worth wanting? Who will help you decide whether John Stuart Mill was right when he said in his book, Utilitarianism, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Indeed, who will tell you that this is a question worth asking? And where will you learn that one reason for studying the sciences is not that they allow us to manage the world, but that understanding how the universe works, understanding where we fit into it, is worthwhile in itself, even if we never use that knowledge to do anything. So Cicero, Humboldt, Bois would give the same answer to these eminently rhetorical questions. These are the questions you learn to face, learn to live with, learn in the end, perhaps even to answer, with the help of literature and the arts, critically appreciated through the study of philosophy and history and cultural anthropology. The importance of humanistic education engaged Bois deeply. In his famous debate with Booker T. Washington, in his famous debate with Booker T. Washington over the education of the Negro, he essentially sides with Humboldt. Washington's up to slavery is very culpable disdain for the sort of education that Humboldt extolled. Washington wrote, "One of the saddest things I saw was a young man who had attended some high school sitting down in a one-room cabin with grease on his clothing, filth all around him, and weeds in the yard garden, engaged in studying of French grammar." In the year The Souls of Black Folk, Washington boasted in an essay on the industrial education for the Negro that Tuskegee, the university he founded, taught, quote, 33 trades and industries. And his list includes carpentry, blacksmithing, brickmaking, tailoring, electrical engineering, dressmaking, cooking, laundry, nursing, and horticulture. Those of you who count, it's not 33, but I'm not going to read more. But there is no mention in there of, say, the classics, the field in which Tony Bois was first professor, philosophy, sociology, history, or literature, all of which he was contributed. It was hard not to draw the inference that there was no need for more people to build of Dr. Du Bois among the Negroes. Du Bois's rejoinder was equally clear. If we make money the object of man training, and we should remember when this was written and substitute person for man throughout, and I know everybody hasn't read it. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop money makers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men we shall have only as we make man the object of the work of the schools, intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world as it is, and of the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of the higher education, which must underlie true life. And he went on to add that the object of all true education is not to make men carpenters, it was to make carpenters men. And Du Bois' carpenter, like Humboldt's, made needs to learn Greek. The racism was to be condemned, accordingly, for depriving the Negro of the ability fully to cultivate his capacities, for hindering the Negro's individual building, for stopping black people from developing ad humanitatem. From his earliest writings, Du Bois sought the realization of that broader humanity which freely recognizes differences in men, but sternly replicates inequality in their opportunities to develop. This was exactly the criticism that people like his teacher, Gustav Schmoller in Berlin, had made of Germany's failure at the end of the 19th century to elevate the working classes in Germany, in their writings on what they called the social question. That is to say, it was wrong to limit Bildung to the Bürgertum. It was wrong to limit self-development to the educated middle classes. Du Bois, like many other African American intellectuals of his day and since, sometimes claimed a special connection for African Americans to the cultural traditions of the African continent, even though, as we have seen, his intellectual and artistic life drew on a cosmopolitan range of materials. This isn't at all surprising, for in his day, the claims of culture were increasingly seen in racial terms. And to see why, we must understand two main concepts of culture that he inherited. And then I'll retire at the end to the question of what this means for the sort of liberal education Du Bois defended. So, this looking fellow, Sir Edward Burnett Tyler, his 1871 book, Primitive Culture, can claim to be the first work of modern anthropology. And it's to Tyler that we know more than anyone else the idea that anthropology is the study of something called culture, which he defined as that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, arts, morals, law, customs, and any other capacity to have its private manner as a member of society. So, now primitive culture was in some respects quarrel with another book that had culture in the title, Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy, a collection that was prepared just 2 years earlier. For Arnold, the great poet and literary critic, culture was the pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know, on all the matters which most concern us, the best which has been thought and said in the world. So Arnold had in mind a moral and aesthetic ideal which found expression in art, in literature, in music, and philosophy. And our notion of culture was thus only one of the many dimensions of Taylorian culture. It was only one of the things that you are doing as a member of society. Nowadays, I think when people speak about culture, it's usually either Tyler's or Arnold's notion that they have in mind. The two concepts of culture are to a degree antagonistic. Arnold's ideal was the man of culture, and he would have considered primitive culture a contradiction in terms. Tyler thought it absurd to propose to the person who lacked culture. Yet these contrasting notions of culture are locked together in our conceptual Western culture, which many people think defines the identity of modern Western people. I'm going to say some things that some of us earlier already discussed. Let's go back now to Herodotus, writing in the 5th century, before the Common Era. For Herodotus, the inhabited earth was divided into three parts. To the east was Asia, to the south was the continent we call Libya, and the rest was Europe. But here's the important point. It would not occur to Herodotus to think that those three names corresponded to three kinds of people: Europeans, Africans, and Asians. He himself was born in Halicarnassus, which is Bodrum in modern Turkey, but being born in Asia Minor didn't make him Asian, it left him Greek. And the Celts in the far west of Europe were much stranger to him than the Persians or the Egyptians, about whom he knew a lot more. Herodotus only uses the word European as an adjective, never as a noun. Europe was a place, not an identity, And for a millennium after his day, no one else spoke of Europeans as a people either. But then the geography that Roberts knew was radically reshaped by the shape of the rising sun, which burst out of Arabia in the 7th century, spreading with us. I'm sorry, you get the general idea. Arabia, everywhere. Spreading with astonishing rapidity, both east and west. After the death of the Prophet in 632, the Arabs managed in a mere 30 years to defeat two great empires to their north. Rome's residue in Byzantium on one hand, and the Persian Empire that reached through Central Asia as far as India on the other. The Umayyads pushed on west into North Africa and east into Central Asia, and in early 1711 they crossed the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, which the Arabs called Al-Andalus. Within 7 years, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim rule, and not until 1492, 800 years later, was the whole peninsula under Christian sovereignty again. The Muslim conquerors of Spain had not planned to stop the Pyrenees, and they made regular attempts in the early years to continue moving north into what was then the domain of the Kingdom of France. But at Tours, in 732 Common Era, Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, defeated the forces of Rahman al-Rafiki, the governor of Al-Andalus, and that turned out to be a decisive battle because it ended the Arab attempts at the conquest of the Kingdom of France. Now, what matters for our purposes in this story is that the first recorded use of the word for Europeans as a kind of person comes, so far as I know, out of history. About this history of conflict. Because in a Latin chronicle written in 754 in Spain, the author refers to the victors of the Battle of Tours as Europenses, Europeans. If that's right, then the very idea of European was first used more than a millennium and a quarter ago to contrast Christians on the one hand and Muslims on the other. So one way of understanding the phrase Western civilization is to think of it as a way of talking about the Taylorian culture, the socially transmitted knowledge, belief, arts, morals, laws, and customs inherited from Europe's Christian past. But of course, scholarly cultures of Christian Europe inevitably inherited many of the ideas of the pagan society that preceded them. Thus, even though the divide between the West and Islam began with the religious culture, not everything in Western civilization is supposed to be Christian. This, too, is a very old idea. At the end of the 12th century, Bois, born near Paris, celebrated these groups. Greece once had the greatest reputation for chivalry and learning, he wrote, when chivalry went to Rome, and so did all learning, which now is on France. So the idea that the best of the culture of Greece was passed by way of Rome into Western culture, Western Europe in the Middle Ages, became a common strategy. And in fact, this process has a name. It's called the translatio studii, the transfer of learning. And this too was an astonishingly persistent idea. More than 6 centuries later, Yale Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the great German philosopher, told the students at the high school he ran in Nuremberg that the foundation of higher study must be and remain Greek literature in the first place, Roman in the second. I can't resist the fact that I'm reminded of a Terry view about Yale Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, which runs, no one ever put in Yale Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel into issuing any kind of apology for his phenomenology. Anyway, from the late Middle Ages through Hegel until now, people have thought of the best of the culture of Greece and Rome as a European inheritance passed on like a precious golden nugget put out of the earth by the Greeks, transferred when the Roman Empire conquered them to Rome, partitioned among the Florentine and Flemish courts of the Venetian Republic, and the Renaissance its fragments passed through cities such as Avignon, Paris, Amsterdam, Weimar, Edinburgh, and London, and were finally reunited, pieced together like the broken shards of a Michelin in places like this, the academies of the United States. The priceless treasure is no doubt nestled somewhere nearby, perhaps in the university library. And its content is the West's unordinary culture, not the everyday habits of life that Tyler had in mind. So there are many ways of embellishing this story, but they all face a historical challenge. If you want to make the golden nugget the core of Western civilization post-Islam, because the classical inheritance it identifies was shared with Muslim learning. In Baghdad, in the 9th century, in the Beit al-Hikmah, the palace library set up under the Abbasid caliphs, the works of Plato and Aristotle, Pythagoras and Euclid were translated into Arabic. In the centuries that Petrarch rather misleadingly called the Dark Ages, when Christian Europe made little contribution to the study of Greek classical philosophy, and many of the texts were lost, these works were preserved by Muslim scholars. And a good deal that we now know about the texts of classical philosophy and how to read them, we know only because that knowledge was recovered by European humanists in the Renaissance from the Arabs. In the mind of its Christian chronicler, as we saw, the Battle of Tours pitted Europeans against Islam. But the Muslims of Al-Andalus, bellicose as they were, and they were, did not think that fighting for territory meant that you couldn't share ideas. By the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, in the cities of the Caliphate of Cordoba, Jews, Christians and Muslims, Arabs, Berbers, Visigoths, Slavs, and countless others created a kind of cultural goulash that generates a genuine revolting. There weren't any recognized rabbis or Muslims at the court of Charlemagne. In the cities of Al-Andalus, there were bishops and synagogues. Hasdai ibn Shaprut, leader of Cordoba's Jewish community in the middle of the 10th century, was not only a great medical scholar, he was the chairman of the Caliph's Medical Council. The knowledge these Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars acquired and developed together made Cordoba one of the great centers of medical knowledge in Europe, and for that matter, the Muslim world. The translation into Latin of the works of Emergence, born there in the 12th century, were central to the European rediscovery of Aristotle. He was known in Latin as Averroes, or more commonly just as the commentator, because he wrote commentaries on Aristotle. So the classical tradition that is meant to distinguish Western civ from the inheritance of the Caliphate is actually a shared root, it's a shared point of contact with them. So the golden nugget story starts to fragment. It imagines Western culture as the expression of an essence, a something that has been passed from hand to hand in a historic journey. People suppose that an identity that survives through time and across space must have something important that is shared through history and across geography, some essence that all the instances share. But that's simply a mistake. What was England like in the days of Chaucer, father of English literature and one story, who died more than 600 years ago? Take whatever you think was distinctive of it, whatever combination of customs, ideas, material things made England English then. Whatever you chose to distinguish Englishness now, it isn't going to be that. Rather, as time rolls on, each generation inherits the label from an earlier one, and in each generation the label comes with a legacy. But as the legacies are lost or exchanged for other treasures, the label keeps moving on. And so, when some of those in one generation move from the territory to which English identity was once tied, move, for example, to a new England, the label will travel outside the territory. Identities can be held together, in other words, by narratives, without essences. You don't get to be called English because there's an essence which that label follows. You're English because we have rules that determine that you're entitled to the label by being connected in the right way to a place called England. So how do people in New York, in Old York, in London, Ontario, and London, Paris, Texas, and Paris, France, get connected into the realm we call the West, and gain an identity as participants in something called Western culture. Well, the term Western culture is surprisingly modern. It's, for example, younger than Edison's phonograph, and Tyler never spoke of it. Tyler never spoke of Western culture. In fact, the very idea of the West, to name a heritage in knowledge of study, doesn't really emerge until the 1890s, during the heated era of imperialism, and gains broader currency really only in the 20th century, when, around the time of the First World War, Oswald Spengler wrote the influential book Translated as the Decline of the West, a book that introduced many people to this idea. He scoffed at the notion that there were continuities between modern European culture and the classical world. If the notion of Christendom was an artifact of a prolonged military struggle against Muslim forces, our modern concept of Western culture largely took its shape during the Cold War. In the chill of battle, we forged a grand narrative about Athenian democracy, the Magna Carta, the Copernican Revolution, and so on, Plato to NATO. Western culture was, at its core, individualistic and democratic and liberty-minded and tolerant and progressive and rational and scientific. Never mind that pre-modern Europe was none of these things, but that until the last century democracy was the exception in Europe, something that few of the main stalwarts of Western thought anything good to say about. The idea that tolerance was constitutive of something called Western culture that would surprise Tyler, who was a Quaker, who denied entrance to Oxford and Cambridge University. So, to be blunt, if Western culture were real, we wouldn't have to spend so much time talking it up. And of course, once Western culture gets used as a phrase, it's bound to be used as this phrase. Critics of Western culture produce a photonegative, emphasizing slavery, segregation, racism, militarism, genocide. And so they're committed to the very same essentialism, even if what they see is a bucket of arsenic rather than a nugget of gold. The defenders of Western civilization saw it as a European inheritance. Its critics have often agreed. Too often, both have conceived of it, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, as a racial possession. If against that background, Du Bois has occasionally tempted the same view, his cosmopolitan instincts usually brought him back. The stories we tell that connect Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and St. Augustine in contemporary American culture have some truth in them, of course. There are self-conscious traditions of scholarship and argumentation, like Humboldt's looking back to Cicero, or Du Bois looking back to Humboldt. The delusion is to think that it satisfies, that it's enough to have access to these values, as if they were tracks in a Spotify playlist that we never quite listen to. If these thinkers are part of our unknown culture, there's no guarantee that what's best in them will continue to be something for the children of those who now go back to them, any more than the centrality of Aristotle's Muslim thought for half a millennium guarantees him an important place in Muslim culture today. Values are not a birthright. We need to keep caring about them. Living in the West, however you find it, or being white, provides no guarantee that we will care about Western civ. The values European humanists espouse belong just as easily to an African or an Asian who takes them up with enthusiasm as to a European. And by that very same logic, they don't belong to a European who hasn't taken the trouble to understand and absorb them. The same is true, naturally, in the other direction. The story of the Golden Nugget suggests that we can't help caring about the traditions of the West because they are ours. The opposite is true. They are ours only if we care about them. Culture, liberty, tolerance, and rational inquiry, that would be a good idea. But these values represent choices to make, not tracks laid down by a Western destiny. In some of the darker recesses of the internet, the enthusiasts for the idea of America as the home of the white race celebrate the achievements they claim to the West as somehow their racial possession. Their organic whole is a noxious mixture of Shakespearean National Socialism, Euclid and ill-informed eugenics, Dante and racist demagogy. Well, I'm inclined to let them keep Nazism, eugenics, and racism, but I don't begrudge them the things I also love, Shakespeare and Dante and Euclid, because, like Bois, I can love what is best in anyone's traditions while sharing them badly with others. If they think that something in them, these people on the internet, if they think there's something in them, some racial essence somehow connects them with an organic essence that pervades Western culture, I have news for them. Neither race nor civilization works the way they believe. But what is best in unknown culture cuts across colour, space, and time. One of Goethe's great poetic cycles, the Östliche Divan, is inspired by the poetry of the 14th century Persian poet Hafiz, whose theme too, in Shiraz, is still a place of pilgrimage. Mansur Basho, the magnificent haiku master of the 17th century in Japan, was shaped to a large degree by Zen Buddhism. And so, in India, Gautama Buddha, is a part of Basho's heritage, though he was born 92 months away. And just to give one final example, Kurosawa's magnificent Throne of Blood, powerful cinematic memory in death. Du Bois was right to engage promiscuously with the arts of Europe and Asia and Africa, claiming all for himself. He loved German culture, taught Latin and Greek, wrote histories of Africa, celebrated Asia and Africa, America and the islands of the sea, aiming to give Arnold's search for the best that has been thought and said a global reach. Culture is messy and muddled and mixed, not pristine and pure. That it has no essence is what makes us free.
Students are very welcome, professors too. Great.
I quite entirely agree with you, and your delivery of such a clear argument so eloquently is, I find, very persuasive. So my question isn't for contrary to you, but I think people resist saying it's all just narrative sometimes because they think folkways have something to them. So, for instance, if I travel to 13 nations in the world, and I think that is the number I travel to, the two nations where I felt most at home are Ireland and India. Ireland made some sense. I had 7 great-grandparents from Ireland. India, no. And I thought a lot about that, and I thought, well, maybe I could think of each culture as accenting a part of being human. And of course, cultures aren't just nations, but if we think that way, and I have a personality born of environment, who knows, biology, learning. But there's an affinity between my personality and whatever folkways happen in India. I don't think of it as essence, nothing like essence. I don't think of it as just narrative. And I'm wondering if Tocqueville's idea of mores is what I'm calling folkways. I don't think that contradicts anything you claim, because I don't think the golden nugget is about folkways. No. But feel free to respond to anything.
Good. That's a great question. I mean, I think that I like the use of the word affinities, because, and then we give you another story of the same sort, which is, my mother was English, and she grew up on a farm in Oxfordshire, and then traveled a bit, and then went to Ghanaian, and took to me. So she ended up living in Ghana. But before she got married to him, her mother wisely said to her, why why she thought it. She said, well, she felt out of place in the place she grew up. And one of the reasons she felt out of place was it was a very, it conforms to a certain stereotype of the English, which is it was very stiff and formal. And she actually, though her family owned the farm, a lot of the land around there, she spent most of the time with people who worked on the farm. She found them more relaxed and a little bit kinder and more entertaining than the other middle class people, apart from her immediate family, that she would otherwise have had to have with. And I think and when she got to Ghana, she discovered in Ghana, everybody would have had exactly the same view of her as she did, because that's something very much better to be more open to people wandering around each other's houses and showing up for tea and assuming that they would be welcome and all that, which is sort of how social developed. So, in other words, there would be a puzzle about that on certain views about culture, even in the Taylorian sense, right? Because in the Taylorian sense, it's supposed to be socially transmitted, but it wasn't socially transmitted by others because she'd never been there. She had never lived in that society. Nevertheless, I think things in the cultural life at every level, the folkways, but also, I mentioned Russia because Russia was one of my other favorite poets, and she was a Japanese actor. You have these verticals, electric affinities, using the term from chemistry. And some of them have to do with how you're brought up, some of them have to do with temperament, maybe some of them, as you say, are just born in us, some kind of genetic predisposition to go to certain things. And that means that the experience you had in India, or that my mother had when she arrived in Ghana, that experience is a reason for going looking. It may not work for you. Maybe G.K. Chesterton, in his book about his visits to America, basically begins the preface by saying roughly, I was very fond of the Americans until I met some. So, that was a joke. I mean, he would have written a whole book about how he hated Americans, because he wouldn't have sold very well. But there is that thing that in some places suit you, in some places don't. And again, that's not just a matter of how you were raised, always. Two brothers across the street from me growing up was a family that a man had a wife and many children. Some of them were my age, so I knew them quite well, and some of them were related. One of those people whom I did know quite well, another man, was the first Ghanaian to become a citizen of Japan. It's very hard to become a citizen. You have to persuade them that you've really got their culture. He's got their culture so much that he and his father-in-law go and watch Japanese baseball. To me, mind-blowingly boring. That's what they do. So, but he has brothers who never left our part of town, and another brother who's a Spanish citizen. So it's not fixed. It doesn't seem to be fixed by family. It doesn't seem to be fixed. It's lots of things. And being open to that, but being willing to say about some places that, given the way I am, it doesn't suit me. I don't want to live in an Irish community. I have great respect for the right of the Irish to live where they want to live, but I know that it wouldn't suit me. Nor would it in Orthodox Yeshiva. So, or a monastery. Just a monastery. Or a Buddhist monastery. There are lots of things I know and enjoy. But, so I think that just shows, I think, that it's sort of what works for people is extremely various. This is the point that John Stuart Mill makes in chapter 3 on liberty over there. Again, he's completely right.
Yeah, I don't know. So I keep thinking about the second part of the title, the ideal of liberal education. So you have, in the way that you're going through, right, so you have each person is an individual, right? And then you have different things that you can call what I was thinking, whenever anybody says cosmopolitan, I don't know if they mean like currently homeless until they have a home, right? Or is that an actual location that you have? Is that an actual settlement that is the cosmos as a whole? Is that a way of making yourself a dwelling that you have?
Right.
So when you say ideal, is it, you seem at the end to say what allows for the goodness of it is the possibility of the freedom to have and practice to bring things together. But then doesn't that, and you're saying what we think of the Western tradition is kind of like hodgepodge piece together, it's not an actual inheritance that we have things that we put together. But can't the thing that you're told at be an eclectic thing put together in precisely Matthewian sense that this is just a hodgepodge eclectic that I put together and I made my own lot of different objects. And so that seems to really be possible if somebody could go and find themselves in their studies of what's called the Western classics. Right. I know it's a hodgepodge, I know it's a Frankenstein monster, but I actually feel at home there. Is the ideal to eclectically make your own home, or in the Matthew Arnold sense of the best that's been thought and said, or to just find whatever full geisty sense and Taylor sense that you have to be in Du Bois' sense of an ideal of the location?
So I think of the cosmopolitans need not be at home anywhere particular, but there's nothing stopping them. There's nothing in cosmopolitanism that stops you from being what's called a cosmopolitan patriot. That is, and you can be at home in more than one place. That's another possibility, which is increasingly a reality for lots of young people because of the way the world works. I have three nephews who are half Norwegian and called it Cornell and the Revolution. One lives in Nigeria, is married in Nigeria, and one's marrying a Russian, is living in London, and so on. And they are both, and the third one, is too complicated. They are both very much at home in other places. England, Norway, and Libya. And they're not at home in Kenya or India. They might come to me, but they're not. So they're deeply invested in the world too, and follow the news about more than one place, but only three. So I don't think it rules that out, but it does allow for the possibility of a person who's engaged with the world, has friends and circles and so on, but who is not particularly attached to any particular place. That is another possibility. I don't myself think that it's one most people engage in. What we have to do in thinking about education is to prepare people for a world in which those are options, as is continuing to be Amish and going back to the Amish community. And I think that going back to the Irish community makes most sense if you have some idea of what it is that you're doing, which means knowing something about what the alternatives are. And that, in fact, is the view of the Irish community, which is why they send their young people out for allowing them to mix. They say, go look at the world. So I think, as far as an ideal, the ideal is to allow people, to get people to see that they have choices to make, give them a rich range of choices, to get them to understand that the things they're choosing among are, it's not so much that they're hodgepodge, it's that they're connected in lots of ways, not just in the bundles, Muslim and Western bundles, or European and bundles, or racial bundles. They're connected in lots of ways. That's why I mentioned Goethe's or Sasha's poetry. These are very German, very Japanese, but they're also connected across lines. And if you really want to understand the unknown in the culture, the high culture, the things that are worth the best that has been said, you're very unlikely to be able to do so if you But as far as education goes, we can't settle this with people. We shouldn't want to settle this with people. As I said, the liberal, the central dogma of liberalism is that each of us has to be in charge of making our own life. What education is providing the resources to do it. If people resources to do it these days require you to be shown that the culture we should care about crosses boundaries as well as lives within them. That's one thing. And I think also that people are likely to enjoy, make more sense of